The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Whitmore Palace as Lady Elizabeth Harrington stepped out of her golden carriage. Her silk gown rustled with each calculated movement, the deep emerald fabric catching the light like precious stones. As the daughter of Duke Harrington, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, Elizabeth had never known a world where her word wasn't law. The palace guards stood at attention as she approached the grand entrance. Their polished armor gleamed, and their faces remained expressionless behind their ceremonial helmets. Elizabeth barely glanced at them as she swept past, her ladies-in-waiting trailing behind like colorful butterflies. Today was different from her usual visits to the palace. King Edmund had summoned all the noble families for an important announcement regarding new trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms. Elizabeth's father, Duke Harrington, controlled the largest shipping ports in the realm, making their attendance crucial to any such discussions. As Elizabeth entered the main hall, she noticed the unusual tension in the air. Servants whispered among themselves in corners, and even the usually confident nobles seemed on edge. The king had been making changes lately, appointing new advisors and implementing policies that didn't always favor the established noble families. Captain Marcus Sterling stood guard near the throne room entrance. At 28, he was younger than most senior guards, but his skill with a sword and unwavering loyalty to the crown had earned him rapid promotions. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his blue eyes held an alertness that missed nothing. Unlike many palace guards who came from noble families, Marcus had risen from humble beginnings in the countryside. Elizabeth approached the entrance where Marcus stood. She expected him to immediately step aside and bow, as was customary for someone of her rank. Instead, Marcus remained in his position and spoke in a calm, professional tone. "My lady, I must ask you to wait. His Majesty is currently in private consultation with the foreign ambassadors. You will be announced when the meeting concludes." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Never in her 24 years had anyone, particularly someone of lower birth, dared to make her wait. Her green eyes flashed with anger, and her perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising dangerously. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" Marcus maintained his composure, though he could see the storm brewing in the noblewoman's expression. "Yes, my lady. You are Lady Elizabeth Harrington. However, the king's orders are clear. No one enters during private consultations." The other nobles in the hall had begun to notice the commotion. Conversations died down as heads turned toward the entrance. Elizabeth could feel their eyes on her, watching to see how she would handle this unprecedented situation. "My father owns half the ships that bring wealth to this kingdom," Elizabeth hissed, stepping closer to Marcus. "The king would be nothing without families like mine. You will step aside immediately, or I will have you stripped of your position." Marcus had faced down enemy soldiers on battlefields, but something about the noblewoman's entitled rage unsettled him. Still, he had sworn an oath to follow the king's commands, regardless of the consequences. "My lady, I understand your frustration, but I cannot disobey a direct order from His Majesty. I'm sure you'll be admitted as soon as the meeting ends." Elizabeth's face turned red with humiliation and fury. The whispers around the hall grew louder, and she could hear snickers from some of the younger nobles. Her reputation as someone who always got her way was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Without thinking, Elizabeth raised her jeweled hand and struck Marcus across the face. The sound echoed through the marble hall like a thunderclap. The captain's head snapped to the side, and a thin line of blood appeared where her rings had cut his cheek. The hall fell into complete silence. Even the servants stopped their work to stare in shock. Striking a royal guard was not just an insult to the individual, but an attack on the crown itself. In the kingdom's history, such an act had resulted in severe punishment, regardless of the perpetrator's social standing. Marcus slowly turned his head back to face Elizabeth, blood trickling down his cheek. His hand instinctively moved toward his sword, but years of training kept him from drawing it. His blue eyes met her green ones, and for a moment, both realized the gravity of what had just occurred. Elizabeth's anger began to fade, replaced by a creeping fear. The other nobles backed away from her as if she carried a plague. She had acted purely on instinct, driven by years of getting everything she wanted, but now she understood she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The massive doors to the throne room began to creak open. King Edmund appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion from within. His tall frame filled the entrance, and his gray eyes quickly took in the scene before him. His bloodied guard, the terrified noblewoman, and the crowd of witnesses. The king's expression was unreadable as he stepped into the hall. At 45, Edmund had ruled for 15 years, and his experience had taught him to control his emotions in public. But those who knew him well could see the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. "What happened here?" the king asked, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. Nobody spoke. Elizabeth found her voice had abandoned her completely. Marcus stood at attention, blood still flowing from the cuts on his face, but his loyalty prevented him from immediately accusing a noblewoman. One of the younger nobles, Lord Thomas Blackwood, finally stepped forward. "Your Majesty, Lady Elizabeth struck Captain Stirling when he followed your orders to deny her immediate entrance." King Edmund's eyes moved from the trembling noblewoman to his injured guard, then to the gathered crowd. The political implications of this moment were enormous. How he handled this situation would set a precedent for how the crown dealt with noble misconduct. Elizabeth finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Majesty, I was simply trying to attend the meeting as requested." "There was a misunderstanding." The king raised his hand for silence. The tension in the hall was so thick it seemed to press down on everyone present. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, possibly changing the relationship between the crown and the noble families forever. King Edmund walked slowly toward Captain Stirling, his footsteps echoing in the deathly quiet hall. Every eye followed his movement as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a silk handkerchief. Without a word, he gently dabbed the blood from Marcus's cheek, an act so unexpected that gasps rippled through the crowd of nobles. "Captain Stirling," the king said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "you have served this crown with honor and distinction. Your loyalty to your duties, even in the face of intimidation, exemplifies everything I expect from my guards." Marcus bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I was simply following your orders." The king then turned to face Elizabeth, who had gone pale as snow. Her hands trembled as she clutched her silk skirts, finally understanding the full weight of her actions. The other nobles watched in fascination and horror, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would reshape palace politics. "Lady Harrington," King Edmund began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel. "In my 15 years as king, I have tried to maintain respect for our noble traditions while also upholding justice for all my subjects. What you have done today forces me to choose between these principles." Duke Harrington suddenly appeared from behind the crowd, having heard about the incident from a servant. His face was grim as he took in the scene. At 62, the Duke had navigated court politics for decades, but even his experience couldn't prepare him for this disaster. "Your Majesty," Duke Harrington said, bowing deeply, "I offer my sincerest apologies for my daughter's inexcusable behavior. She has clearly forgotten herself and the respect owed to your crown and your servants." Elizabeth shot a look of betrayal at her father. She had expected him to defend her, to use his influence to minimize the consequences. Instead, he was distancing himself from her actions, protecting his own position at her expense. King Edmund acknowledged the Duke with a nod but kept his attention on Elizabeth. "Your father speaks wisely, but this matter cannot be resolved with simple apologies. Captain Sterling represents my authority in this palace. An attack on him is an attack on me and the crown I wear." The foreign ambassadors who had been meeting with the king emerged from the throne room drawn by the commotion. Among them was Ambassador Rodriguez from the southern kingdom of Valdoria, a man known for his sharp political instincts. He observed the scene with great interest, understanding that how King Edmund handled this situation would reveal much about his character and the stability of his rule. "Your Majesty," Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice shaking but determined to salvage what she could. "I acted in a moment of frustration. Surely my family's long service to the crown and our contributions to the kingdom's prosperity should count for something." This statement proved to be Elizabeth's greatest mistake. By invoking her family's wealth and influence, she had essentially argued that noble blood made her above the law. The king's expression darkened, and several nobles in the crowd looked horrified at her boldness. King Edmund stepped closer to Elizabeth, his presence commanding and intimidating. "Are you suggesting, Lady Harrington, that your family's gold should purchase you immunity from the consequences of striking one of my guards?" Elizabeth realized too late that she had trapped herself. Any answer would only make things worse. If she said yes, she would confirm that she believed wealth put her above justice. If she said no, she would admit she had no defense for her actions. I meant no disrespect to your authority, Your Majesty," she stammered. "Yet disrespect is exactly what you have shown," the king replied. "You have disrespected my guard, my orders, and by extension me. You have done this in front of foreign ambassadors, making it a matter of international observation." Ambassador Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the king. "Your Majesty, in Valdoria, such an assault on a royal guard would result in immediate imprisonment, regardless of the perpetrator's station. How you handle this matter will be reported to my king." The political implications were now crystal clear. If King Edmund appeared weak by giving Elizabeth special treatment, it would damage his reputation with foreign powers and embolden other nobles to challenge royal authority. If he punished her too harshly, he risked alienating the powerful noble families whose support kept his kingdom stable. Captain Sterling, still standing at attention despite his injury, made an unexpected decision. "Your Majesty, if I may speak?" King Edmund nodded, curious about what his loyal guard would say. "Your Majesty, Lady Harrington was clearly upset about being denied entry. Perhaps her actions, while inexcusable, came from frustration rather than true malice toward the crown." Elizabeth looked at Marcus in surprise. After she had humiliated and injured him, he was trying to minimize her punishment. His nobility of character stood in sharp contrast to her entitled behavior, a fact not lost on anyone present. But King Edmund was far too experienced to be swayed by mercy alone. "Captain Sterling, your generosity of spirit is noted and appreciated. However, justice must be served not just for this incident, but to prevent future occurrences." The king paused, considering his options carefully. The entire hall held its breath, waiting for his decision. Noble families throughout the kingdom would hear about this moment, and his choice would influence how they treated royal servants and authority for years to come. "Lady Elizabeth Harrington," the king announced formally, "you will be confined to the palace guest quarters for 3 days, while I consider your punishment. During this time, you will not be permitted to leave the palace grounds or receive visitors except for your immediate family." Elizabeth's mouth fell open. Being confined like a common criminal was humiliating beyond her worst nightmares. But before she could protest, the king continued. "Furthermore, you will personally apologize to Captain Sterling and compensate him for his injury. The amount will be determined by the royal treasurer, not by your family's wealth." Duke Harrington bowed again. Your Majesty is most merciful. My daughter will comply with all your requirements. But King Edmund wasn't finished. I am also implementing new protocols for the palace. From this day forward, any assault on a royal guard or servant will result in immediate banishment from court, regardless of the perpetrator's noble status. This applies to every family, including the Harringtons. The message was clear. The age of noble immunity was ending. Several nobles in the crowd looked uncomfortable, knowing they had treated palace servants poorly in the past. As palace guards stepped forward to escort Elizabeth to her confinement, she finally understood the magnitude of her actions. Her moment of entitled rage had not only humiliated her personally, but had also diminished her entire family's influence at court. The king's decision sent shockwaves through the noble community that would reshape palace life forever. 3 days later, Elizabeth emerged from her confinement a changed woman. The luxurious guest quarters that had served as her prison felt more restrictive than any dungeon could have. During those long hours of isolation, she had been forced to confront the reality of her behavior and its consequences for the first time in her privileged life. The palace hallways buzzed with whispered conversations about her punishment and the king's new policies. Servants who had previously cowered before noble anger now walked with straighter spines, knowing they had royal protection. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Elizabeth made her way to the guard quarters, where she had been instructed to offer her formal apology to Captain Sterling. Her steps were hesitant, each one a reminder of how far she had fallen from her previous position of unquestionable authority. The emerald gown she wore seemed heavier now, weighted down by shame and regret. Captain Sterling was polishing his sword when she arrived. The cuts on his cheek had healed into thin scars that would serve as permanent reminders of their encounter. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral but not hostile. "Captain Sterling," Elizabeth began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have come to apologize for my inexcusable behavior 3 days ago. My actions were wrong, and I deeply regret striking you." Marcus set down his sword and stood, studying her face carefully. The arrogant noblewoman who had attacked him had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled by recent events. "Lady Harrington, I accept your apology. I hope this experience has taught us both valuable lessons about respect and duty." Elizabeth reached into her purse and withdrew a heavy pouch of gold coins. "The royal treasurer determined this compensation for your injury and the humiliation you suffered. I know money cannot undo what I did, but I hope it demonstrates my sincere remorse." As Marcus accepted the payment, Elizabeth surprised herself by adding, "I realize now that I have lived my entire life believing my birth made me superior to others. You showed more nobility in those moments after I struck you than I have shown in 24 years of life." Word of Elizabeth's transformation spread quickly through the palace. Some nobles viewed her humility as weakness, while others saw wisdom in her acceptance of the new reality. The incident had created 2 camps among the nobility: those who resented the king's assertion of authority and those who recognized the need for change. Duke Harrington summoned his daughter to his private chambers that evening. The study was filled with the symbols of their family's power: portraits of ancestors, maps of their shipping routes, and shelves lined with trade agreements. But the recent events had shown how fragile that power truly was. "Elizabeth," her father said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "your actions have damaged our family's relationship with the crown. It will take years to rebuild the trust you destroyed in minutes." Elizabeth sat quietly, accepting his criticism without the defiant arguments she would have offered in the past. "Father, I understand the gravity of my mistakes. What can I do to help repair the damage?" The Duke was surprised by her mature response. "The king has agreed to let you return to court, but you will be watched closely. Any further incidents will result in permanent banishment for our entire family." Over the following weeks, Elizabeth began a careful campaign to rebuild her reputation. She treated palace servants with courtesy, thanked guards for their service, and listened more than she spoke during court gatherings. The change was so dramatic that many courtiers wondered if she was simply acting until the scandal faded. Captain Sterling watched these developments with interest. During their few interactions, he sensed that Elizabeth's transformation was genuine. Her apology had revealed a capacity for growth that surprised him, and he found himself hoping she would maintain her new perspective. King Edmund also observed Elizabeth's behavior carefully. His decision to punish her rather than simply overlook the incident had been a calculated risk. If she had remained defiant, it could have triggered a rebellion among the noble families. Instead, her acceptance of consequences had strengthened his authority while demonstrating the possibility of redemption. The foreign ambassadors who had witnessed the original incident reported back to their kingdoms with admiration for King Edmund's handling of the situation. Ambassador Rodriguez wrote to his king that the English monarch had shown both strength in defending his authority and wisdom in offering a path to redemption. 6 months after the incident, Captain Sterling was promoted to head of the Royal Guard, partly due to his professional handling of the confrontation with Elizabeth. During the ceremony, Elizabeth approached him with a small gift. "Captain Sterling," she said formally, "I wanted to congratulate you on your promotion. I also brought you this." She handed him a small wooden box containing an ornate compass. "My lady, this is very generous but unnecessary," Marcus replied, examining the beautiful craftsmanship. "The compass belonged to my grandfather," Elizabeth explained. "He told me it always points toward true north, no matter how lost you might feel. I thought it was appropriate for someone whose moral compass never wavers, even under pressure." This gesture marked the final stage of Elizabeth's rehabilitation in the eyes of the court. She had moved beyond mere apology to genuine respect for the man she had wronged. The gift became a symbol throughout the palace of how people could change and grow from their mistakes. The incident's long-term effects reshaped palace culture permanently. Servants and guards gained confidence in their protected status, leading to better service and increased loyalty to the crown. Noble families learned to treat all palace staff with respect, knowing that abuse would have serious consequences. Elizabeth herself became an advocate for treating all people with dignity, regardless of their birth. She used her family's shipping business to implement fair labor practices and better working conditions for common sailors and dock workers. Her transformation from entitled aristocrat to thoughtful leader inspired others to examine their own behavior. Years later, when historians wrote about King Edmund's reign, they identified the confrontation between Elizabeth Harrington and Captain Sterling as a turning point. It marked the end of the old system where noble birth granted unlimited privilege and began an era where justice applied equally to all social classes. Elizabeth never forgot the lesson learned that day. True nobility comes not from bloodlines or wealth, but from how one treats others, especially those with less power. The scars on Captain Sterling's cheek faded over time, but the changes they represented in palace culture and Elizabeth's character lasted for generations. The story became a cautionary tale told throughout the kingdom about the dangers of entitlement and the possibility of redemption through genuine humility and change.